Tonight, we'll be looking back at some of the most haunting disasters ever recorded in human history. Before you settle in and get comfortable, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe but only if you truly enjoy mysterious things. Now, dim the lights, and let's begin tonight's journey together. Number 1. The Summerland Fire. On the evening of August 2nd, 1973, three boys were playing at the miniature golf course outside the Summerland Leisure Complex on the Isle of Man. They slipped into an empty ticket booth to sneak a few cigarettes. The oldest of them was only 14. Their greatest worry at that moment was being caught smoking, but within minutes, they would face something far worse. A single dropped match ignited a small flame that quickly grew beyond control. The boys panicked and fled. They survived. Dozens of others inside Summerland that night would not. Completed in 1971, Summerland was unlike any structure in the British Isles. It was marketed as a marvel of modern design, a 5-story indoor resort capable of accommodating up to 10,000 visitors. Inside were restaurants and bars, a sun lounge, an underground dance hall, saunas, a skating rink, an arcade, a small amusement area, and an indoor pool known as the Aquadrome. Every surface gleamed with futuristic confidence. The entire complex was built primarily of metal and plastic. A promotional brochure proudly proclaimed that the bold design would light up the world of architecture. Within its walls, it was always summer. It never rained, the wind never blew, and the temperature was forever perfect. Families could spend the whole day beneath an artificial sun, swim in turquoise pools, and move from one form of entertainment to the next without ever stepping outside. It was a vision of leisure made real, and people came in droves. 500,000 visitors arrived in its first year alone. Between 1971 and 1973, countless happy memories were made inside its plastic walls, and there was a lot of hope and aid to them. For a time, Summerland flourished, but on that warm evening in midsummer, paradise turned to hell. Around 7:50 p.m., on August 2nd, the three boys from Liverpool accidentally started the fire while smoking near the miniature golf course. Their small hideaway ignited, and the burning booth collapsed against the outer wall of the complex. Guests who spotted the flames alerted staff, but the response was disastrously slow. Seeing that the fire was outside, employees assumed it posed no serious threat. They believed the outer shell was fire-resistant and decided there was no need to evacuate. Instead, they tried to fight the blaze themselves, using extinguishers, garden hoses, and even iron bars. No one called the fire brigade. With little training and no clear authority, staff members thought they could manage the situation. But hidden within the walls, the flames found a layer of highly flammable material sandwiched between the outer panels. Unseen, the fire spread upward and inward until it erupted into the main building. Even as smoke began to fill the air, new guests were still being admitted. No one at Summerland had yet sounded the alarm. The first emergency call came from miles away, from people on nearby hills who saw the smoke, and even from a ship's captain offshore who radioed the harbor. Inside, confusion reigned. The first to notice the danger were in the arcade, where flames burst through a wall and raced across the ceiling. Panic spread instantly. Families were separated as they ran. Many of the staff, young and untrained, could do little to help. One ride operator fled without shutting off the carousel, forcing parents and strangers to pull terrified children from the moving horses. Elsewhere, an entertainer tried to calm his audience, insisting the smoke came from a frying pan. Moments later, realizing the truth, he began shouting for everyone to run. What followed was chaos. Families were scattered across different floors, children watching a magician on one level, parents sunbathing on another. When the fire reached the interior, many ignored the nearest exits, instead racing through the smoke to find their loved ones. Escape routes were few. Many doors had been locked or even chained to prevent unpaid entry. The glass boxes that were meant to hold keys to the fire exits were often empty or mounted too high for most people to reach. In one tragic case, an exit was blocked by a parked car, belonging, ironically, to Summerland's own safety officer. Guests smashed windows and battered doors with whatever they could find. But even those who escaped faced a new horror: the very skin of the building. Much of Summerlin's exterior was sheathed in a translucent plastic called auroglass, later nicknamed the horror glass. As the building burned, the plastic melted and dripped in fiery sheets, raining down on those who tried to flee. Most of the fatalities occurred in the central atrium. The open-plan design that once symbolized freedom now allowed flames, smoke, and superheated air to sweep through unimpeded. Many people collapsed while attempting to reach lower levels via narrow, exposed stairways. At some points, the crush on the staircases grew so desperate that parents threw their children from balconies, hoping someone below would catch them. Some leapt themselves. A few heroic employees stayed behind, soaking their clothing with fire extinguishers to withstand the heat just long enough to help more people out. No fire alarms ever rang. The control circuits had been destroyed before the system could activate. When firefighters finally arrived, they drew water from the swimming pools to seawater, later pumping seawater, to fight the inferno. Ambulances carried the injured to the local hospital for more than 2 hours until the last survivor was evacuated in critical condition. By midnight, the rescue was over. Fire crews began the grim task of recovering bodies, a process that would take days. In the end, 50 people were dead and 80 more seriously injured. The public inquiry that followed exposed a chain of failures. Fire exits should never have been locked or chained. Staff should have been trained in emergency procedures. The fire brigade should have been called within a minute of the first sight of flames. But the worst mistakes had been made long before opening day. Budget constraints had forced multiple contractors to work separately, each unaware of the other's designs. The company that built the outer shell had no clear plan of the interior, so exits were misplaced. The interior designers had unknowingly compromised the fireproofing installed by others. Materials were chosen for cost, not safety. Auroglass, despite its flammability, was approved under the misguided belief that it would soften and fall away during a fire, supposedly easing escape. The automatic sprinkler system was deemed too expensive and omitted altogether. Again and again, convenience and economy were placed above human life. The inquiry's conclusion was damning but oddly merciful. No villain to blame, it read, only human error and failure. The same verdict applied to the 3 boys whose carelessness had sparked the blaze. They were identified, brought to court, and fined £3 each. The gutted remains of Summerland were demolished and rebuilt, smaller, divided into safer compartments, constructed from traditional materials, and equipped with modern alarms and sprinklers. Every design change bore the lessons of that night, standing as a monument to reform in public safety. Yet in 2002, a flood destroyed the rebuilt complex, and it too was torn down. Today, nothing remains of Summerland but a scarred cliff face overlooking the sea. All that endures are the memories, and the hope that the lessons learned, paid for in blood, will never be forgotten. Number 2. The Cairngorm Plateau Disaster. On November 19, 1971, a group of high school students from Ainsley Park School in Edinburgh set off for what was meant to be a weekend adventure in the Cairngorm Mountains, AGS, a rugged range that rises north of the city. When a brutal storm swept across the highlands, what began as a weekend excursion quickly turned into a desperate fight for survival. By the end, 6 members of the group would never return. The United Kingdom is not a land known for its wilderness. Nearly every acre is privately owned or cultivated, and even the remaining forests are carefully managed. There are no deserts, no vast inland lakes, no endless untouched frontiers. Even in the nation's national parks, civilization is rarely more than a few hours away. For that reason, the Cairngorms of Scotland are often considered one of the last true wild regions in Britain. It is the largest national park in the country, named for its most prominent peak, Cairngorm. The park offers nearly every kind of outdoor pursuit imaginable: hiking, climbing, camping, kayaking, and cycling. It is the only place in Britain where reindeer still roam free and home to wildlife found nowhere else in the Isles. The Cairngorms are majestic and breathtaking, but also treacherous. Sheer slopes, sudden avalanches, and fatal slips are not uncommon here. Yet, the greatest danger is the weather. At altitude, conditions can change within minutes. Although several small shelters, known as bothies, have been built across the plateau to offer basic protection, these structures are primitive, little more than metal or stone huts designed for emergencies. One of them, the Curran Bothy, would soon become the center of the worst mountaineering tragedy in British history. On November 19th, 14 students from Ainsley Park arrived at the Laganlia Outdoor Center near the Cairngorms, MDA, their base for the first night. The following morning, they would attempt a 17-kilometer trek from Cairngorm to Ben Macdui, Britain's second highest mountain. It was a demanding route for 15-year-olds, but the students were excited. The plan was to practice winter camping and snow shelters. Leading the expedition was 23-year-old instructor Ben Beattie, accompanied by his girlfriend Catherine Davidson, aged 20, and volunteer assistant Sheila Sunderland, 18. Catherine had less experience than Ben but had already spent several winters in the Cairngorms. With forecasts warning of poor weather, the trip had been reviewed and approved with precautions in place. The group carried adequate cold weather gear, and a contingency plan specified that if conditions worsened, they would abandon their goal and seek refuge at Curran Bothy. The next morning, they departed later than planned, driving to the car park before taking a funicular lift up the slopes. From there, the students split into two groups. The more experienced trekkers followed Ben, while the less experienced 6 were led by Catherine and Sheila. As the day wore on, the weather deteriorated rapidly. Both groups realized they would have to divert to Curran Bothy. Ben's team managed to reach the shelter after digging through snowdrifts to clear the entrance, settling in for the night amid howling winds. Despite the storm, they assumed that Catherine's group had found safety in a lower hut. But Catherine's group had veered off course. Instead of being near Curran Bothy, they were miles away, attempting to reach another emergency shelter. Before they could get there, a whiteout struck, fierce snow, gale force winds, and near-zero visibility. Terrified of getting completely lost, Catherine decided they would stop and dig in for the night. They built a snow wall and huddled behind it, pressing close together to share warmth. To understand what happened next, one must appreciate the lethal nature of cold on the plateau. Sub-zero temperatures dull the mind, freeze the fingers, and make the simplest task agonizingly slow. Actions that would take minutes in normal conditions stretch into hours. As the body diverts energy to stay alive, exhaustion takes over, movement becomes impossible, and sleep, the most dangerous temptation of all, creeps in. At first, spirits were high. The group talked and sang to keep morale up, but fatigue soon silenced them. When dawn broke, they found themselves nearly buried under snow. Only Catherine and one boy, William Kerr, could still move. Together, they dug frantically to free the others and tried to keep them awake. Realizing how dire the situation was, Catherine and William attempted to go for help but managed only a few steps before the snow swallowed them to the waist and the shrieking wind forced them back. From that moment on, their only hope was rescue. Meanwhile, Ben's team, still trapped inside their snowbound shelter, decided to retreat. It was a punishing descent. They dug themselves out, rappelled down icy slopes, and narrowly avoided a serious fall when one student slipped. Through determination and luck, they reached the town of Aviemore late that afternoon. When they arrived, it became clear that Catherine's team had not returned. Authorities were alerted immediately. Search and rescue teams spread out across the mountains, firing flares into the storm. Some came astonishingly close to where the missing group lay buried. Catherine herself saw one of the flares through the blizzard and tried to respond, but her own signal was buried beneath the snow, and her shouts were swallowed by the howling wind. The rescuers passed within sight, unaware, leaving the students to face another night in the storm. By Monday morning, nearly 48 hours after the expedition began, Catherine and William made one last desperate attempt to seek help. William collapsed, overcome by exhaustion. Catherine pressed on, staggering and crawling through the snow until, by sheer luck, the bright orange of her jacket caught the eye of a helicopter crew. She was airlifted to safety, barely conscious, but lucid enough to describe their approximate location. Rescue teams found the others a few hours later. For most, it was too late. William Kerr, Susan Byrne, Lorraine Margaret, Diane Dudgeon, SUA, all aged 15, along with 16-year-old Carol Bertram and 18-year-old Sheila Sunderland, had succumbed to the cold. Only 15-year-old Raymond Leslie, the smallest of the group, survived, shielded by the bodies of his friends who had huddled close around him through the night. A formal inquiry the following year found multiple failures. Such a challenging winter route should never have been approved for school children, DZ, especially with severe weather forecast. Investigators recommended that future outdoor leaders hold certified qualifications and that expeditions be carefully tailored to participants' age and ability, particularly when involving minors. The inquiry, however, did not assign individual blame, nor did it ban youth expeditions to the Cairngorms, recognizing the educational value of outdoor challenges. It also questioned the very presence of shelters like Curran Bothy. Some argued they were essential for safety, while others believed their existence tempted groups to press farther into danger rather than turn back. In the end, Curran Bothy and another nearby shelter were dismantled, yet the Cairngorms still welcome tens of thousands of visitors each year. Schools continue to bring students, and Laganlia remains in use, though every trip is now led by trained, certified guides. There have been minor incidents since, but never again a tragedy on the scale of the Cairngorm Plateau disaster, a grim reminder of how quickly nature can humble even the most careful of human plans. Number 3. Disaster on Webb's Bait Farm. At around 9:15 in the morning on May 27, 1983, a violent explosion tore through a small farm near Benton, Tennessee. The blast was heard more than 20 miles away and sent a mushroom-shaped column of smoke rising as high as a 6-story building. The site was almost leveled. Outbuildings were shredded, debris rained across the property, and several workers were killed instantly. What could unleash such force at a modest rural bait farm? The property was Webb's Bait Farm, named for its owner, Dan Lee Webb. Open since 1978, it raised worms and other live bait and sold basic fishing tackle. It was a humble operation. Webb hired friends and relatives, and he took construction jobs on the side to make ends meet. Nothing about it suggested even a minor risk of explosion. Yet when law enforcement arrived that morning, they found structures obliterated, fragments of equipment strewn everywhere, and the unthinkable, dozens of human remains scattered through the wreckage. 11 people had died. Only one survived with grievous injuries: Tommy, Webb's cousin. He had been cutting grass when the blast threw him nearly the length of a football field. Burns covered roughly 30% of his body. He was airlifted out and, against the odds, lived. Identifying the dead was agonizing work. The explosion not only killed the workers, it stripped them of personal effects and, in some cases, dismembered them. Body parts were found as far as 150 meters from the epicenter. Many remains were burned and badly distorted, complicating the task further. With help from a forensic anthropologist, investigators eventually named the victims, among them Webb's mother, brother, and uncle. Webb himself was off-site at the moment of the blast. His wife, Linda Sue, had been at the farm that morning but left before authorities arrived. The reason she fled became clear quickly. Amid the carnage, deputies found explosive chemicals and mixing gear, items that had no place on a worm farm. Locals told police the business had been hiring far more workers than seemed normal. In the months before the disaster, small bangs had been heard from the outbuildings. Security was unusually tight: electrified fencing, surveillance cameras, guard dogs, alarms, excessive measures for a place that raised bait. The picture sharpened when officers discovered cases of illicit fireworks and 6 drums of explosive chemicals in a trailer. The volume suggested something far beyond holiday sparklers, perhaps bomb-making for criminals or terrorists. The truth emerged a few days later when Dan Lee Webb surrendered. He admitted that, beginning in December of 1982, he had launched a new line of business on the property, an illegal fireworks factory. The workshop operated out of a metal cattle shed and was wildly profitable. Crates of M80 and M100 devices, ECO, banned under federal law, MUS, sold for $160 a case, and the crew could turn out as many as 130 cases a week. The cash flow let Webb hire roughly 14 workers at $5 an hour, paid in cash at day's end. Those workers mixed and assembled the charges with almost no protective gear, little training, and scant understanding of the danger. Webb was charged with unlawful possession and manufacture of explosives and with 11 counts of involuntary manslaughter. In a brief proceeding, he pled guilty and received a 10-year sentence and a $10,000 fine. Many considered the punishment lenient, not even a year per life lost, but the court likely weighed the fact that many victims were Webb's friends and relatives. 3 were members of his own family. Guilt and grief were part of his sentence. And Webb had not conceived the scheme alone. Without outside pressure, he might never have turned the bait farm into a factory. A longtime acquaintance, Howard Emmett Bramblett, had pitched the idea and connected Webb to suppliers and a distribution network. A sweeping federal investigation followed, leading to the arrest of Bramblett and 19 others across 9 states for transporting and distributing fireworks from Webb's farm. 4 of the defendants were ultimately convicted. Bramblett, identified as the ringleader, received a 10-year sentence to run concurrently with another 10-year term tied to a 1983 illegal fireworks blast in South Carolina that killed 2 people. He had approached Webb at a desperate moment, dangling the promise of easy money, a lifeline for a failing farm. Webb took the deal and lost everything: friends, family, livelihood, property, and his freedom. Though he has long since completed his sentence, the memory of those who died, his workers, his loved ones, remains a burden he will carry for life. It was a catastrophic price to pay for profits that amounted to little more than $100 per case. Number 4. The story of the Edmund Fitzgerald. On November 9, 1975, the freighter SS Edmund Fitzgerald departed from the port of Superior, Wisconsin, crossing Lake Superior with its cargo holds filled to the brim with taconite iron ore pellets. It was a route the ship had sailed countless times before, but this voyage would be different. The Edmund Fitzgerald would never reach Detroit, Michigan as planned. All 29 crew members aboard would be lost. Construction of the Edmund Fitzgerald began in 1957 and was completed the following year. At the time, it was the largest vessel ever to sail the Great Lakes, stretching 730 feet from bow to stern. Owned by the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, the ship was named after the firm's president, Edmund Fitzgerald, who took great pride in what was then considered a technological marvel. The crew shared that pride. During its early years, the Edmund Fitzgerald was celebrated for hauling record-breaking tonnage in a single season while maintaining a spotless safety record. It also became a favorite among ship watchers and tourists, especially under the command of Captain Peter Pulser, and who was famous for playing music over the ship's loudspeakers and using a megaphone to chat with onlookers as the vessel passed through locks and harbors. Freight transport across the Great Lakes might sound monotonous, and indeed the Fitzgerald was often described as the workhorse of the fleet. Yet to those who sailed her, she was a beloved workhorse. Carefully maintained, she was expected to remain in service well into the 2000s, if all went as planned. But fate had other ideas. On November 9, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald departed Superior at 2:15 in the afternoon, bound for Detroit. The weather forecast at departure looked favorable. A storm was predicted to pass through early the next morning, but forecasters expected it to move south of Lake Superior, sparing the route. 5 hours later, the forecast changed. The storm would sweep directly across the lake, bringing hurricane-force winds. At the helm was 63-year-old Captain Ernest M. McSorley. Upon hearing the update, he altered course toward the Canadian shore in hopes of sheltering from the wind and waves. By 1 a.m. on November 10th, the Fitzgerald was battling a full-force gale. Winds were topping 50 knots, with waves exceeding 10 feet slamming into the hull. The ship pushed forward, battered but unbroken. By mid-afternoon, conditions had worsened. Heavy snow reduced visibility to almost nothing, and the vessel was crawling forward at barely a few knots. At 3:30 p.m., Captain McSorley radioed the SS Arthur M. Anderson, a nearby freighter traveling the same route roughly 10 miles behind. He reported, "I've got a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and we're taking a list." In other words, the ship was leaning to one side. McSorley asked the Anderson to stay close in case they needed help. At about 7:10 that evening, the first mate aboard the Anderson checked in again. "Fitzgerald, how are you making out with your problem?" McSorley's calm reply came over the static. "We are holding our own." Those would be his final words. Repeated calls from the Anderson went unanswered. The Fitzgerald had vanished from radar. The Anderson's crew contacted the Coast Guard, first expressing concern, then formally reporting the ship missing. By 9 p.m., the Anderson had reached safe anchorage in Whitefish Bay, between Michigan and Ontario. Moments later, the Coast Guard radioed back with an extraordinary request: return to the open lake and search for the missing freighter. Captain Cooper's weary response captured the peril of the storm. "All right, I'll go back out and take a look, but Lord, I'm afraid I'm going to get the hell beat out of me. I'll give it a try." Despite the danger, the Arthur M. Anderson led the search effort. No trace of the Edmund Fitzgerald was found that night, only a mangled lifeboat and a scattering of debris on the surface. After hours of futile searching in near impossible conditions, there was only one conclusion left to draw. The Fitzgerald had gone down with all hands. The disaster raised haunting questions. Why had the ship sunk so suddenly? Why was there no distress call? And why had nearby vessels survived the same storm? Investigations and speculation followed for years, but no definitive answer was ever reached. When the wreck was located 5 days later, sonar and dive expeditions revealed that the ship lay broken cleanly in two on the lakebed, fueling theories that it had snapped apart on the surface under the immense strain of the waves. Others argued it had been engulfed by a rogue wave, or that flooding in the cargo hold had dragged it under. Some even suggested it had struck a shoal in the blinding snowstorm. Critics later pointed out that under Captain McSorley, maintenance standards may have slipped. Certain minor damages had gone unrepaired, and McSorley was known for pushing his vessels to their limits, refusing delays even in bad weather. Those choices may have contributed, though no single cause was ever proven. The tragedy led to sweeping reforms. Depth finders became mandatory for all large freighters. Survival suits were required for every crew member. Navigation systems and weather communication across the Great Lakes were upgraded, and the U.S. Coast Guard introduced far stricter inspection standards. No voyage across these waters is ever truly safe, but since those changes, no comparable loss has occurred. At Whitefish Point, Michigan, a memorial now honors the 29 sailors who perished. The ship's bell and anchor were later recovered and placed on display as solemn reminders of their sacrifice. The men of the Edmund Fitzgerald were skilled, proud mariners, ordinary workers, performing an extraordinary duty. We may never know exactly what doomed them, but we can understand what they faced. A life spent braving the world's largest inland seas so that commerce and industry might continue. To this day, freighters still cross Lake Superior under gray November skies, their journeys routine and unremarkable, yet every one of them sails in the long shadow of the Edmund Fitzgerald. Number 5. The Kaproun Disaster. On the morning of November 11, 2000, a fire broke out aboard a funicular train, climbing toward the ski resort at Kaproun, Austria. The automatic safety system brought the train to a halt midway through its tunnel ascent. Midway through, ascent blaze, but almost simultaneously, the blaze destroyed the hydraulic lines that controlled the doors. 162 passengers were now trapped twice over, locked inside a burning carriage, motionless in a smoke-filled tunnel. Despite desperate efforts by several aboard, the vast majority would not survive. Kaproun was, and still is, a beloved alpine destination, known for the Kitzsteinhorn mountain and its glacier that allows year-round skiing and other winter sports. The town of Kaproun sits at the mountain's base, an ideal location for anyone wishing to spend long days on the slopes. The first transport system to carry skiers up Kitzsteinhorn was built in 1965, a 3-stage gondola line. Visitors simply boarded small cars that rose nearly 3,000 meters to the summit before skiing down at leisure. Within a decade, the area's popularity exploded, and a more powerful system was needed. At enormous expense, a new funicular railway was built. Funiculars are typically found on very steep slopes. The principle is simple. 2 cars are linked by a cable. As one descends, the other ascends. In older systems, water was pumped into a ballast tank on the downhill car, making it heavy enough to pull the other upward. The Kaproun funicular, like most modern designs, was powered mechanically from the top station rather than by gravity. It carried guests from Kaproun to the Alpine Center on Kitzsteinhorn, where they could access the glacier slopes directly. The line stretched nearly 4,000 meters, most of it inside a narrow tunnel barely wide enough for one train, except at a passing point halfway up. Even after a modernization in 1993, the trains remained simple machines. All propulsion systems were located outside the cars, and on board there was no engineer, only an attendant whose job was to monitor progress and open or close doors on signal. Shortly after 9 a.m., on November 11th, the uphill train departed as usual, carrying 161 passengers and 1 attendant, but minutes later, a small electric fan heater at the rear caught fire. The flames quickly melted plastic hydraulic hoses filled with flammable fluid, spreading the fire rapidly and disabling the door controls. The automatic system then stopped the train roughly 600 meters inside the tunnel. When the attendant realized the car was on fire, he tried to release the doors using the control panel, but the hydraulic pressure was gone. He attempted manual operation, but electrical cables had already burned through, plunging the train into darkness. Amid dense, toxic smoke, passengers struggled to breathe. Some tried smashing windows, but the acrylic panes were shatter-resistant and refused to break. Only a handful of passengers near the back managed to punch through the glass using ski poles. Following the advice of a volunteer firefighter among them, they ran downhill, toward the flames, knowing it was their only chance. 12 people eventually reached the tunnel's lower entrance alive. They were the sole survivors. Back on the train, the attendant finally forced a door open by hand, but it was already too late. Many passengers had collapsed from smoke and heat. Those who could still move instinctively fled uphill, away from the visible fire. That reflex proved fatal. The tunnel acted like a giant chimney, funneling searing smoke and gas upward. None who ran toward the summit survived. Even at the top station, 3 people died when the smoke burst through the exit and filled the terminal before it could be evacuated. Meanwhile, another funicular, DS, the descending car, was in the tunnel as well. Fortunately, it carried only 2 people that morning, an attendant and a passenger. Both died of smoke inhalation. In total, 155 lives were lost. Tourists, winter sport enthusiasts, and several promising young athletes. Their nationalities spanned continents, and the tragedy's emotional toll was felt around the world. Investigators soon traced the fire's origin, astonishingly, to a household electric heater. A device designed for warming small rooms had been improperly installed inside a passenger vehicle. It may have been contaminated by leaking hydraulic oil, accelerating the fire. The heater was identified as the direct cause, though deeper problems quickly emerged. The funicular lacked even the most basic safety features. Its acrylic windows were nearly unbreakable. Fire extinguishers were locked in the operator's compartment. Passengers had no way to signal an emergency. Such features were standard elsewhere by the year 2000, but absent here, largely because the trains were assumed to be fireproof. Constructed mostly of aluminum, steel, and limited plastic components, the funicular was thought to pose minimal fire risk. That misplaced confidence was reinforced by decades without a single incident. No one had considered the flammability of the hydraulic oil running through the door system. 16 people were charged, including employees responsible for the train's maintenance and operation. But after lengthy proceedings, all were acquitted. The court found no provable negligence, only systemic failures, and a lack of foresight shared by many. The burned tunnel was sealed permanently, and the entire railway dismantled. 2 new lifts, a chairlift and a gondola, were built in its place. In 2004, a memorial was unveiled, a circle of colored glass panels catching the mountain light, each representing 1 life lost. Before Kaprun, no funicular had ever burned. The disaster forced rail and mountain transport authorities worldwide to rewrite fire safety protocols, conduct regular evacuation drills, and redesign cars with escape routes and fire-resistant materials. Today, funiculars remain rare, fascinating machines, but the lesson of Kaprun endures. Every safety rule written for them has been paid for, somewhere, in blood. Number 6. Soyuz 11. On June 30th, 1971, the spacecraft Soyuz 11 re-entered Earth's atmosphere after 3 weeks in orbit. Aboard were 3 cosmonauts who had appeared on television screens across the Soviet Union, UI, and around the world, for weeks. They were already celebrated as heroes, brave spacefarers taking on a perilous, pioneering mission and setting a new endurance record for time spent in space. Millions awaited their safe return. But when the capsule touched down and the recovery team knocked on the hatch, no one answered. Something had gone terribly wrong. The space race, the fierce mid-20th century competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, sought to claim the firsts of the space age. It was a technological confrontation often seen as a proxy for direct conflict between 2 superpowers. Since the Soviets launched Sputnik 1 in 1957, the contest had leapt to the heavens. Breakthroughs came in rapid succession, turning American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts into household names, American placing them in extraordinary danger. The Soviets seized the early lead by following Sputnik with the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin aboard Vostok 1 in 1961. The next decade brought triumph and tragedy for both sides. In 1967, 3 American astronauts died in the Apollo 1 pad fire. Later that year, cosmonaut Vladimir Komarov was killed when Soyuz 1 crashed after its parachute failed. Even so, the programs accelerated. In 1968, the United States tested Apollo 7 successfully. A year later, Apollo 11 put Americans on the moon. In response, the Soviets launched Salyut 1 in 1971, HE, the world's first space station. The debut was promising but imperfect. A protective cover over the station's telescope failed to open, crippling key observations and forcing hasty revisions to mission goals. A few days later, Soyuz 10 launched with 3 cosmonauts aiming to dock and live aboard Salyut 1 for a month. The docking attempt failed, and the crew returned home bitterly disappointed. The next attempt would be Soyuz 11. Initially, the backup crew from Soyuz 10 was scheduled to fly. 4 days before launch, Valery Kubasov felt unwell. A chest X-ray showed a slight shadow in his right lung. Doctors feared tuberculosis. By Ministry of Health rules, the entire crew was grounded. Later, it emerged the shadow was an allergic reaction. MRMN, not TB. The misdiagnosis saved 3 lives and doomed their replacements. The new crew of Soyuz 11, Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev, launched from Kazakhstan on June 6, 1971. The Soyuz capsule was cramped. There was no room for pressure suits during ascent or re-entry. On June 7th, they achieved what Soyuz 10 could not: a successful docking with Salyut 1. They remained on the station for 23 days, the longest any humans had lived in space to that point. They conducted experiments and operated a gamma-ray telescope. Patsayev became the first person to use such an instrument in orbit. They observed Earth's weather, tended plants, including Chinese cabbage and onions, studied tadpoles, algae, and fruit flies, and performed cardiovascular tests on themselves. Much of it was pioneering, beyond, and remarkably public. For the first time, a space mission provided regular updates to the general public, including a live television broadcast from orbit. Not everything went smoothly. Long, monotonous watches, with at least one crew member awake at all times, took a toll. The trio had only days to prepare. Of the 3, only Volkov had flown before. Doctors monitoring the mission understandably worried about their mental strain. On June 16th, the crew smelled smoke, the result of a small electrical fire. Guided from the ground by veteran cosmonaut Alexei Yeliseyev, they extinguished it, then spent the night in the docked Soyuz while the station's air was scrubbed. The crisis passed, but the scare lingered. The crew asked to come home early. Mission control insisted conditions were safe. Meanwhile, upbeat television segments continued to air almost daily, omitting stress and setbacks. On June 19th, Patsayev celebrated his 38th birthday, becoming the first person to mark a birthday in space. In the final days, the crew packed film and samples. On June 29th, Soyuz 11 undocked, orbited Earth 3 times in formation flight, and then began re-entry procedures. As planned, the orbital and service modules separated, leaving only the small descent module with the crew. At that moment, communications ceased, alarming, but not unprecedented, since descent was largely automated. The capsule deployed its parachutes and touched down apparently intact. Recovery forces arrived within 10 minutes and found the craft in good condition. They knocked. No reply. The hatch opened onto a nightmare. All 3 men were unresponsive. Resuscitation failed. The death message to mission control used a simple 5-point health code: 5 for excellent, 1 for worst. The report was chilling: 1, 1, 1. The cause of death was not officially disclosed for nearly 2 years. The mission had captured the public imagination. Officials preferred to emphasize its scientific achievements rather than the catastrophe. In the United States, the loss prompted fears that the human body might not endure prolonged spaceflight. Eventually, the truth emerged. During module separation, a valve malfunctioned and opened. Air vented into vacuum with terrifying speed. With no room for pressure suits in the capsule, the 3 men asphyxiated. Patsayev's body was found nearest the valve, suggesting he lived long enough to recognize the problem, but not long enough to fix it. Alexei Leonov, originally slated to command Soyuz 11 before the crew switch, had urged that these valves be manually locked. He did not trust the automatic system. The backup crew apparently did not perform the manual lock. Leonov later tested the procedure and found it took nearly a full minute, far longer than the few seconds the doomed crew had. Their deaths devastated the nation. The three were posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. Their bodies lay in state in Moscow before a state funeral. Witnesses recalled Leonid Brezhnev wiping away tears, a rare public display from a Soviet leader. A month later, Apollo 15 astronauts placed a small memorial at a site on the moon. In 1973, a monument was erected near the Soyuz 11 landing area. In 2016, it was replaced with a new marker. On the lunar surface, 3 craters now bear their names. Hard lessons followed. Subsequent Soyuz generations received redesigned, more robust valves with rapid manual locks. Crews were required to wear pressure suits for every launch and re-entry. Thanks to these changes, flights after Soyuz 11 have been far safer, and, in part because of them, the 3 men lost on the return of Soyuz 11 remain the only humans to have died outside Earth's atmosphere. And that's the full story for tonight. The next video will be coming soon, and trust me, it's going to be even more surprising and intense. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss what's next. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. I always love hearing from you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. And I'll see you in the next one. And I'll see you in the next one. And I'll see you in the